When the HOA declared my private dam unsightly and forced it to be torn down, they had no idea it was the only thing keeping their entire neighborhood from becoming a floodplain. I warned them. I even showed them the original engineering plans. But they laughed, fined me, and ordered its demolition. 6 months later, the rains came early, and the roaring flood that followed didn't just destroy their homes. It exposed their lies, their illegal developments, and the secret that made the news across the entire state. It all began with the dam, my dam, not some makeshift pile of rocks or rotted wood held together with pipe dreams, but a fully engineered, county-approved, reinforced concrete dam that I had poured, built, and maintained myself over the span of a decade with the help of local contractors, 2 civil engineers, and enough environmental paperwork to paper the walls of City Hall 3 times over. It sat at the southern edge of my 60-acre property, a broad, silent wall across the natural watercourse that had once flooded the valley every few years before I settled here and took it upon myself to tame it, not to block the water entirely, but to slow it, guide it, control it through the seasons so that the creeks didn't rage and the culverts didn't blow out in the entire downstream basin, which now included that shiny, new HOA-backed development called Elms Ridge Estates, didn't end up under 2 feet of brown river sludge every monsoon season. For 10 years it stood without complaint. The neighbors, before the HOA called it genius, even asked me to help them reinforce their ditches or clear their runoffs because you clearly know what you're doing, old man. I was no hero, just a man with a background in hydrology, a quiet piece of land I loved, and enough bad experiences with spring floods to know better than to leave nature unchecked. But then came the HOA, a self-appointed group of yuppies in golf carts and tennis visors, most of them not from this state, let alone this terrain, people who bought into Elms Ridge Estates thinking they were getting luxury cabins and lakefront serenity without ever asking where the lake came from or what held it back. They came in loud, confident, and quick to declare what was and wasn't appropriate for community aesthetics, and within 3 weeks of the board's formation, I received my first notice, a letter stapled to my fence like I was a ranch hand and not the landowner, stating that my unsightly dam structure is in violation of the HOA view standards, and that I had 30 days to bring the property into compliance or face escalating fines. I laughed at first, genuinely, sat on my porch with a beer, held the paper up to the sun like a joke, and tossed it on the burn pile. I didn't live under their jurisdiction, my property was never annexed into their HOA boundaries. I made sure that the moment developers started sniffing around the adjacent lots. But the letters kept coming, official-looking, then certified, then hand-delivered by a smug little man with hair too perfect to trust. "Mr. Havers," he said like he'd rehearsed it in a mirror, "the board is giving you a fair opportunity to correct the visual intrusion before we escalate to county review." I told him what he could do with his fair opportunity and shut the gate. Still, something told me this wasn't going away. They didn't just dislike the dam, they hated it. Called it an eyesore, a hazard, an illegal structure. Built by a stubborn old man who didn't respect modern community values. They filed complaints with the County 5, in fact, all of which were dismissed until a new county commissioner with friends on the HOA board suddenly found code violations that had never existed before. I was ordered to attend a zoning hearing where 3 of the 5 panel members had direct ties to Elms Ridge, and despite showing up with my permits, engineer reports, floodplain charts, and even time-stamped photos proving the dam's effectiveness during seasonal runoff, I was told that residential harmony must be prioritized. Residential harmony. That was the phrase they used to justify destroying a functional, life-saving piece of infrastructure because it didn't match the manicured image of their retirement magazine fantasies. I appealed, naturally. Spent thousands on lawyers. But it didn't matter. The deck was stacked. The HOA had influence, connections, and, worst of all, money. They offered to buy me out at a fraction of my property's worth, said I should retire somewhere quieter and let them modernize the land. When I refused, the fines started. Thousands of dollars for non-compliance, even though I wasn't under their authority. I sued, they countersued. They filed injunctions, I filed restraining orders. It became a war not just of land, but of stubbornness, and unfortunately for them, I had more of both. But even my stubbornness had limits, and when they managed to get a demolition order pushed through a corrupt county zoning office, I knew what was coming. They didn't wait for appeal. One morning, I heard engines, bulldozers, excavators, trucks with county plates, and when I ran to the backfield, I watched in stunned silence as they tore into the face of the dam like it was a condemned shack, not a structurally sound barrier with rebar thicker than their necks. I screamed, waved papers, tried to stop them. But the sheriff on site, also a neighbor and HOA donor, threatened to arrest me for obstruction. So I stood there, powerless, as they cracked it open, pulled it apart, and let the water pour free. The creek surged, wild and hungry, washing over years of careful redirection in a single afternoon. The next day, they sent a letter thanking me for my cooperation and informing me that I was now in full compliance with HOA expectations. They even suggested planting a community garden in the newly exposed flood basin. That was the moment I knew they had signed their own sentence, not out of malice, but out of ignorance. They didn't understand the land. They didn't respect it. And the land doesn't forgive. I rebuilt what I could, patched what I was allowed, and spent the following months documenting everything: rainfall data, soil saturation levels, creek velocity increases, all of it backed by sensors, cameras, and private surveyors. I submitted the reports to the county, the state, FEMA, even the Corps of Engineers. No one moved. No one cared. The HOA had money, and I was just the old man with a grudge. Then the rains came early, heavy, and without mercy. I watched the skies darken in late September, a month ahead of schedule, and the first storm dumped more in one night than we'd seen in 2 years. The ground soaked fast, and without the dam to slow the runoff, the basin below Elms Ridge Estates became a bowl with no drain. But that's another chapter. For now, just remember this: they hated the dam because they didn't build it, didn't understand it, and didn't like that someone outside their control could hold back nature. They didn't just destroy a wall, they destroyed the only thing standing between their dream homes and the consequences of their own arrogance. And I warned them. God help me, I warned them. After the bulldozers packed up and the last chunk of my dam was hauled off like a piece of illegal scrap metal, there was an eerie silence over the property. As if even the land knew something had been violated, something vital torn away by people too arrogant to understand what they'd done. And in the weeks that followed, I kept thinking maybe, just maybe, someone would come back and admit they'd overstepped, that they'd acted hastily, that they'd let property values matter more than engineering data, more than water tables, more than lives. But no, instead I got letters, more letters, all with the HOA's ridiculous gold seal logo printed on fake parchment paper like they were royalty issuing decrees, thank you notices for my compliance, followed by new demands: landscape restoration within 30 days, garden installation plan approval, ornamental fencing height limits, and the most insulting of all, a $1,200 fine for exposed erosion hazard, referring to the freshly torn up trench left behind after their demolition crew finished gutting the dam that had literally prevented that very erosion for years. I called the county again, this time getting shuffled between departments until a sleepy-sounding official told me the matter was already resolved administratively and hung up on me mid-sentence. I sent certified letters, emails, made phone calls, even tried setting up a private meeting with the County Environmental Review Board, but each attempt was ignored or delayed, always citing updated zoning priorities or pending development negotiations, code words for, "We've already sold this land out from under you and your logic doesn't fit our blueprint." Still, I wasn't about to roll over. I did what I've always done: documented, photographed, monitored. I set up trail cameras where the dam used to be, installed new water level gauges in the feeder creeks, even reprogrammed my old hydrology modeling software to account for the missing structure. The readings were clear, dangerously so. Without the dam, the water flowed fast, too fast, carving deeper into the land, saturating the banks on both sides of the creek and making every inch of soil looser, more volatile. And it wasn't just theory. I watched it happening day by day, trees leaning ever so slightly, ground slumping near the fence line, and worst of all, the natural floodplain beginning to shift west, directly toward Elms Ridge's lowest cul-de-sac. I sent the data to the HOA. No response. I tried again, this time including photos of newly formed cracks in the basin, pointing out how one good week of rain could overwhelm the community's own pathetic storm drains. This time they responded with another fine: unauthorized installation of monitoring equipment in shared visual corridor. Visual corridor. That's what they called the dried riverbed my dam had kept calm for a decade. I attended their next board meeting uninvited, stood in the back while they read minutes about flower beds and mailbox colors, then raised my hand and said, "You're all sleepwalking into a disaster." Karen, the same woman who'd led the charge against me, now smugly seated as HOA president. rolled her eyes and said, "This isn't a weather meeting, Mr. Havers. This is a community standards meeting." So I handed her a flash drive, told her it contained rainfall simulations, soil absorption models, and potential floodplain expansion charts based on the last 3 years of data. She dropped it on the table without looking. "We'll review it in committee," she said, like I just handed her a flyer for a bake sale. I turned to the room, half expecting anyone, to speak up, to say, maybe we should hear him out. But nothing. Blank stares. One guy even laughed. It was like trying to teach calculus to houseplants. So I left, knowing full well what was coming, but still hoping foolishly that maybe nature would spare them the worst. That's when the harassment began. Not just the fines. They were petty $300 for non-regulation mulch, $850 for unauthorized creek access, even a notice claiming my fencing style was visually disruptive. I ignored most of them. But then came the drive-bys, HOA board members slowly rolling past my gate at night, cameras on, windows half open. I caught one walking through my field with a clipboard at dawn. When I confronted him, he mumbled something about boundary inspections and ran off. That same week, someone poisoned 3 of my windbreak trees near the edge of the ridge, big, strong ones that help stop runoff. The bark peeled like paper, leaves died overnight. I reported it. Sheriff said, "Can't prove it." I set up more cameras, caught 2 teenagers throwing rocks at my water meters. They were wearing Elms Ridge Youth Club shirts. Still no action. I started locking everything. Then came the fake complaints, code enforcement showing up asking why I had illegal camping structures on my property. It was my tool shed. The very one that passed inspection 6 times in 10 years. The only reason I wasn't losing my mind completely was because I had the truth on my side and the evidence. I documented everything. Every violation letter, every camera feed. Every rainfall measurement. I created time-lapse videos of the changing creek, showed exactly how fast the erosion was spreading. By mid-October, the dry season, my readings already showed groundwater saturation that was double normal, meaning the soil was primed, ready to turn into a sponge at the first real storm. And still, they did nothing. Karen even sent out a community email bragging that the final removal of the unsightly dam has opened beautiful new landscape views and improved the value of Phase 2 properties. They were already planning to build more homes in the very basin where my dam used to hold back seasonal runoff. It was insanity wrapped in arrogance. And I knew there would be no stopping it, because by now it wasn't just ignorance, it was pride. They couldn't backtrack. Couldn't admit I was right. Couldn't accept they doomed themselves. So they doubled down. Final notices arrived. Threats of lien placement. A court summons for non-compliance. I showed up to court with my documentation. The judge was a friend of Karen's cousin. Case dismissed. By November, the weather patterns began shifting. Early clouds. Colder nights. The kind of wind that rolls down the mountains when winter's coming early. I checked the historical data, everything was trending toward an unseasonal deluge. I tried contacting the local meteorological office. Unlikely, they said. Too soon for panic. I called the county hydrologist. No reply. So I did what they wouldn't. I prepared. Cleared the backup trenches near my land. Rerouted my personal drainage. Sandbagged my lower fields. And then I waited, knowing full well that the flood wouldn't just bring water. It would bring truth. And it would not politely. If there was ever a moment that signaled we'd crossed from petty HOA squabbles into outright environmental sabotage, it was the day I received the official demolition order. Not from the HOA directly, but from the County Land Management Office, signed by a commissioner I'd never met, citing a list of infractions that didn't even exist when the dam was first inspected and approved a decade ago, terms like unauthorized hydrological barrier, visual obstruction to community easement, and my personal favorite, potential disruption of natural watercourse aesthetics, which sounded less like a legal concern and more like something Karen cooked up after watching too many landscaping shows. I remember standing at my gate, reading the order with disbelief as the county courier, a nervous young man barely out of college, told me he was just doing his job before jogging back to his county-marked SUV and driving off like he just handed a rabid dog a meat bone. I looked down at the stamp date and realized the demolition was scheduled for the following Monday, 5 days away. And unless I wanted to be hit with contempt, obstruction, and a $25,000 fine, I was expected to comply without protest. 5 days to tear down the one thing standing between a community of overpriced homes and a floodplain no one wanted to admit existed. I called my attorney, who told me flatly, "You won't win this in court. The county's in bed with that HOA. The judge is part of their advisory committee." I contacted the local news. Crickets. Environmental boards. Sorry, outside our jurisdiction. I even called the state water authority, who acknowledged my permits were still active, but said they couldn't overrule a local zoning override unless significant public harm was proven. It would be proven, all right, but only after the damage was done. With nothing left in the legal toolbox, I tried the only option remaining, warning them one last time. I prepared a full floodplain report, 50 pages long, color-coded maps, saturation charts, erosion studies, rainfall predictions, even historic flood data from before I built the dam, and mailed it certified to the HOA, the county, the zoning board, and the Elms Ridge Development Office. It was ignored by all. The HOA issued a statement in their newsletter that I was attempting to sow fear and misinformation to preserve an illegal structure. Karen herself held a public board meeting, live-streamed on their website, where she laughed and said, "If this man cared so much about his dam, maybe he should have joined the community instead of fighting it." The audience clapped. Laughed. They had no idea what was coming. Monday arrived with a gray sky and the low rumble of diesel engines. I stood at the edge of the ridge as 3 county trucks rolled in with backhoes, a crew of 7 men wearing reflective vests and hard hats, one of them carrying blueprints I recognized immediately, copies of my original plans, stripped of their annotations and rebranded as unauthorized construction diagrams. I tried to speak to the foreman, a burly guy named Marvin who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Just following orders," he muttered. "They say it's dangerous." "It's dangerous now," I snapped, pointing at the waterline already creeping up the trench from recent rains. "It wasn't dangerous when it was holding that back." He shrugged, signaled his men, and the machines fired up. I watched helplessly as they gouged into the concrete face of the dam, tearing into a structure that had never failed, never leaked, never cracked even under record storms. Water seeped immediately. Not enough for disaster yet, but enough that the creek's pitch changed, enough that gravity took notice. The first slab fell by noon. The second by 3. By dusk, the entire middle section had been breached, and a low roar echoed across the basin as water flowed freely where none had before. They didn't finish the job that day. Claimed the rain was picking up, would return tomorrow. But I knew that gap was enough, it had already changed the land. The water didn't rush like a tsunami, it crept, quiet and steady, testing the boundaries like a burglar in the dark. I stayed up that night watching it from my porch, the moon casting long reflections on the surface. I'd spent years mastering its behavior, understanding the seasons, reading the ground like a book. Now I was watching the final chapter be rewritten by idiots. The next day, the HOA sent me a bill for cleanup costs and unauthorized concrete disposal. The audacity of it nearly broke me. But what really did was watching the residents of Elms Ridge celebrate on their community forum. "View finally restored," wrote one. "No more monster dam ruining the skyline," said another. They were planning a barbecue in the new open space. Karen called it a victory for shared living values. I wanted to scream. Not because of pride, but because I absolutely knew what was coming. I had run the math. Without the dam, the rainfall rate needed to breach the basin was just 2.7 inches over 48 hours. Historically, we hit that once every 5 to 7 years. But the recent climate pattern showed a 70% chance of that happening in the coming month. And even that was a best-case scenario. A real storm, just one major cell, could overwhelm the ground in 12 hours. I submitted my data to the regional hydrology database. I sent copies to the state. Nothing. It was like the land itself had been erased from the map. Then, 2 nights later, it rained. Just lightly, half an inch maybe, but it was enough to reveal the truth. My lower trench, now exposed, was starting to sink. The erosion on the eastern slope increased fivefold in a day. The water, no longer slowed by the dam, had carved a new channel, one that cut straight toward Elms Ridge. I took photos, video, even drone footage. I sent it all to the HOA, attached with a note, "You need to prepare. You're in danger." They never replied. The next day, I got a cease and desist for harassing community leadership. I printed it, framed it, and hung it in my shop. It was the last thing they'd send me before the flood. It began with a drizzle, nothing dramatic, nothing you'd write home about, just a soft, steady rain that started on a Thursday afternoon and blanketed the valley in that deceptive quiet that only those who've lived near flood zones can truly recognize, the kind of rain that doesn't shout or roar but whispers of something brewing underneath. And I remember stepping onto my porch, coffee in hand, watching the first rivulets slide down the gutters, listening to the soft ping of drops on tin, and thinking to myself, this is it, the warning shot, because my instruments had been screaming for days prior, my saturation meters already tipping red without a drop having hit the ground, the topsoil bloated from unusually humid air and cloud cover that had kept the ground from ever fully drying since early September, and I knew deep in my bones and reinforced by every graph, sensor, and drone feed that the ground couldn't take much more. Still, the HOA remained silent, the developers smug, the residents oblivious. Having just hosted their open-view celebration potluck on the freshly exposed floodplain where the dam once held steady ground, complete with folding chairs, grilled bratwurst, and families posing for selfies with their kids in front of a thank you, it showed banner strung between two oaks that I knew wouldn't be standing for long. That night, the rain thickened into a soaking sheet, and the wind carried with it the kind of chill that only moves in when weather systems collide over warm, swollen earth. I checked my sensors again, groundwater saturation at 89%. Creek inflow 400% above average, and downstream velocity rising by the hour. I emailed the county. Again. No reply. I texted the local reporter who had promised to circle back. Nothing. So I did what I always did, prepared. I walked my land in rain boots and a poncho, flashlight slicing through the dark, checked every trench, cleared every outlet, reinforced the last of the sandbags I'd quietly placed near the edge of my western fence. And even though I wasn't obligated, I drove down to Elms Ridge, parked just outside the gate, and watched as water pooled where sidewalks should have been minor, for now, just puddles licking driveways, but I knew it was the beginning. The next day, the rain didn't stop. It intensified. Local forecasts shrugged it off as a minor atmospheric river, but the numbers told a different story. This wasn't a casual fall storm. This was an unseasonal monsoon event pushing 3 inches over 2 days across an area with no functioning water retention barrier. I tried once more, sent Karen and the HOA board a video, time-stamped, showing the erosion already starting to undercut the soil beneath their new Phase 2 development lot. No response. Instead, I got a neighborhood-wide email from the HOA calling me a known agitator who continues to spread fear and misinformation. I laughed an ugly, bitter sound I didn't recognize as my own. By Saturday morning, the third day of rain, the earth began to move. My cameras caught at first a slow collapse of the northern slope where the dam once anchored into the hillside. Without the concrete stabilizing force, the hill began shedding layers like an old snake, sending clay, root systems, and boulders tumbling into what was now an open channel. The water roared louder. Not from rage, but from momentum. Downstream, the community's artificial creek pathway, installed post-demolition as part of the HOA's eco-beautification plan, began to buckle under pressure, spilling over into backyards. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A young voice said, "Mr. Havers? My dad said to ask you, do you still have that drone footage of the basin?" I asked who it was. "My name's Alex. I'm from Elms Ridge." My dad said something's wrong. "Our backyard's gone." I told him to tell his father to get everyone out. Immediately. That was when the alarms began at shrill, municipal emergency tones echoing through phones, local radio, and TV stations. Flash flood warning, evacuate low-lying areas. But by then, it was too late for many. The natural bowl shape of Elms Ridge, a selling point the developers had pitched as nestled, private serenity, became its death trap. Without the dam, runoff had no buffer, no delay, and the saturated ground gave way like sponge cake under a fire hose. Basements filled in minutes. Power cut out. I watched from my ridge as lights flickered and died one by one. Roads became rivers. That decorative community pond they loved so much? It became an overfilled reservoir, breached from 3 sides, turning neighborhood walking paths into mudslides. Karen's house, the highest elevation in the subdivision, held out longer than most, but not forever. A drone feed I had running caught the moment her retaining wall buckled and her landscaped koi pond exploded into a torrent that swept through her backyard and into the street, joining the chaos already devouring the lower lots. Emergency services couldn't reach them. The roads were gone. Bridges downstream collapsed. I heard over the scanner that rescue boats had been deployed but couldn't navigate the debris. Helicopters weren't flying due to the weather cell. So they were on their own. Those who mocked me, finally, tore down the one thing that would have bought them hours, maybe days, maybe enough time to escape. And suddenly, as I watched the place turn into a swamp of broken fences, overturned SUVs, and floating patio furniture, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sick. Because I had warned them not once, not twice, but dozens of times, and they laughed, threatened, and silenced me. I hadn't wanted this. I just wanted them to listen. And now, all I could do was watch as the rain continued, relentless and cold, washing away the illusion of safety they built with their little rules and community newsletters. The first rain was never the problem. It was the arrogance that followed. By the 4th day of nonstop rain, the soil wasn't just wet. It was liquefied, saturated beyond recovery, transformed from firm earth into a viscous, rotting stew that carried whole chunks of hillside with it as gravity took control, and as dawn broke through the slate-gray clouds. What remained of the once pristine Elms Ridge estates was no longer a neighborhood but a ruin, and driveways had cracked open like fault lines, front yards had vanished beneath churning waves of mud, and houses that once boasted elevated views were now twisted, sunken shells. Lodged halfway into a drowning basin they had never been meant to occupy, I stood on my own ridge that morning with a pair of binoculars, rain hammering my jacket, and watched as the very earth beneath their dream homes gave way. Slopes caved in like wet cardboard, retaining walls popped like snapped ribs, and water moved with such force that pickup trucks floated sideways into garages, some spinning slowly in place like forgotten toys. This wasn't erosion, it was obliteration. The kind of geologic event people usually associate with remote mountain villages or third-world flooding, but here it was, playing out in front of suburban cul-de-sacs and American flags flapping half-submerged in ankle-deep water. And the worst part wasn't the destruction, it was the sound, a deep, muffled, ever-present groan beneath the surface, like the land itself was trying to cry out after years of being ignored and paved over and sculpted into something it never wanted to be. Around noon, a section of the eastern development slid completely, collapsing like a sandcastle kicked by a toddler. 4 homes, foundations and all, dropped 6 feet in under 30 seconds, a mudflow pulling them down like a hungry beast. One of those homes had belonged to a man who'd once called me a doomsday nut job at a community hearing when I warned them about the risks. Now I could see the same man standing on what used to be his porch, barefoot, drenched, clutching a dog and screaming into a dead phone. FEMA hadn't arrived yet. Local emergency services were stretched thin. The floodplain, which the HOA swore never existed, was now a churning, waist-high lake of mud, sewage, propane tanks, and broken dreams. I could see people wading through it with backpacks on, kids in plastic tubs, some crying, some too stunned to speak. The HOA's fancy decorative gazebo was floating like a ghost ship, torn free from its concrete anchors. And through it all, the only voice of authority came from a portable speaker someone had rigged to a generator, playing evacuation instructions that few could hear over the roar of water and snapping trees. Karen? She hadn't been seen since the previous night. Rumors swirled. Some said she tried to leave early and got her SUV stuck in a culvert. Others said she was holed up in her second-story bathroom posting on social media asking why the National Guard hadn't shown up yet. I didn't care. I was busy coordinating with real responders agents I knew from prior flood studies, men and women who trusted my reports even if the HOA never did. We were pulling live data from my sensors, predicting where the next slide might occur, sending out unofficial alerts via ham radio and emergency comms to neighbors outside the HOA who still had time to sandbag their properties. But Elms Ridge was past saving. I knew it. The county would soon know it. The only thing left was for the truth to be laid bare. By evening, the road leading into the neighborhood was gone, washed out by a surge from the upper ridge, and for the first time in its history, the HOA issued an emergency request for state evacuation assistance through official channels. Irony, of course, since they'd voted against the installation of a reinforced emergency access road during development, citing cost and unnecessary pessimism. Now helicopters were the only option, but weather grounded them. And so, as night fell and the fifth storm front rolled in, lightning flashing like warning signs across the sky, the residents of Elms Ridge, the same ones who cheered as my dam was dismantled, the same ones who fined me for visual violations, were now trapped in a living nightmare of their own making, crawling onto rooftops, setting off flares, trying to climb through second-story windows as mud and water devoured everything below. I could see it all, because I had never stopped watching, never stopped measuring, never stopped caring even when they told me I was the problem. And now, the collapse they called impossible was unfolding in real time. One neighbor who had once sued me for auditory pollution because my creek overflowed near his patio was now screaming into the void, his backyard a crater. Another who'd torn down flood markers I'd installed near the fence line for ruining the view was now stacking sandbags against his kitchen door with his bare hands. I didn't feel joy. I felt rage. Not at them, but at the arrogance, the bureaucracy, the blindness that had allowed this to happen, that had weaponized community rules against scientific truth. I pulled out a worn folder, my original dam permits, maps, rainfall predictions, everything I had sent, ignored, laughed at. It was all right there. Proof. I would send it again, this time to state officials, media outlets, insurance investigators. Not for revenge, but for justice. This collapse wasn't a freak accident. It was engineered, sanctioned, and executed by people who thought they knew better than nature. And nature never forgets. I watched as the last lights in the valley blinked out one by one. The land had spoken. And it was just getting started. By the sixth day, the flood zone had become a graveyard of delusion. A vast, mud-choked basin filled with floating wreckage and shattered egos, where once pristine homes sat half-submerged like forgotten artifacts of hubris, their foundations torn out from beneath them, drywall melting into slurry, designer patio sets appended and lodged against trees like mockery, and Elms Ridge Estates, the pride of the HOA and their real estate empire, had transformed into the very thing I warned them it would become, a cautionary tale written in water and failure, and as dawn broke, casting a gray light over the destruction, I stood overlooking the valley with the same binoculars I'd used to watch it all unfold, but now the image was almost surreal. Rescue boats navigating what used to be driveways, first responders wading through waist-deep muck with GPS beacons and stretchers, helicopters finally circling above trying to identify the most critical zones for airlift, and scattered clusters of residents huddled on rooftops, wrapped in blankets, many with no shoes, all looking like survivors of something they'd never even considered a possibility. I could see them pointing toward the ridge, toward me, and I couldn't tell whether they hated me for being right or were silently begging for help, but either way, it didn't matter, because I had already given them everything I could before this happened. They just refused to listen. FEMA had finally arrived, and with them came news vans, drone operators, insurance reps in waterproof boots, and state officials clutching clipboards and radios, their brows furrowed as they tried to comprehend how a neighborhood less than 5 years old could collapse like it was built on swamp. I walked down into the chaos for the first time since the storm began, not because I wanted to, but because they needed someone who understood what the hell was happening. A National Guard officer recognized me immediately. He'd read my floodplain simulations last year when I submitted them to the State Hydrology Bureau. "Havers," he said, pulling off his wet helmet, "you were right. This wasn't just negligence. This was sabotage." I nodded once and handed him a drive containing sensor logs, erosion models, before and after drone footage, and the timeline of my warnings that had been ignored, rejected, and even mocked. He said nothing, just signaled to his team and walked off with the urgency of a man who knew the report would end up in front of a federal committee. As I waded through what used to be the HOA's ornamental community corridor, now a current-filled ditch full of shredded lawn signs, toppled mailboxes, and displaced koi fish, I spotted remnants of the gazebo half buried in silt, a plastic banner still clinging to it with the words Elms Ridge HOA Community Day stretched across it like a cruel joke. The smell of fuel, sewage, and rotting lumber filled the air. Karen's house, once the highest and most protected in the development, was a soaked skeleton, one wall missing entirely, revealing her marble kitchen and the still hanging pendant light swaying gently above a floodline now painted halfway up the cabinets. I saw her then, mud-covered, staggering, still dressed in a pink blouse now gray with filth, arguing with a rescue worker as if she had the authority to redirect their priorities. "You don't understand, this can't happen. This was a controlled community," she shrieked, to which the rescuer calmly responded, "Ma'am, the water doesn't care about your HOA charter." And that was it, the phrase that summed up everything. The water didn't care. It never had. And now, no one could pretend otherwise. Reporters began showing up in rain jackets, interviewing residents on camera, some angry, some broken, others just confused. Their voices shaking as they described the water coming out of nowhere were rising faster than they could think. A few blamed me, of course, because that's easier than blaming themselves, but the truth was already slipping into the mainstream, fed by records, satellite imagery, and a timeline that clearly showed when the dam was removed and how soon after the flooding began. And as the truth spread, the narrative flipped. Journalists started asking questions. Why was the dam demolished despite engineering warnings? Why were flood permits ignored? Who pushed the county to override environmental codes? And, most damningly, how could an HOA board with no engineering background legally dictate water management over a non-member's property? As the camera crews filmed the ruins, the HOA board, those who hadn't resigned or fled, went silent. Karen was taken aside by federal agents before she could get in front of a microphone. Rumors flew that subpoenas had already been issued. I didn't need revenge. I had vindication. I gave a short press conference on the ridge, flanked by officials who once ignored me but now stood quietly as I explained how the dam had worked, why it was built, and how its destruction led to the flooding of an entire development. "I didn't build that dam for me," I said. "I built it because this land has memory. Because it's not a playground. It's a living system. And you can't control nature with fines and landscaping brochures." Reporters nodded, scribbled notes. Others filmed as I handed out documentation copies and shook hands with those willing to listen now. Still, as I walked away, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest, not satisfaction, but sorrow. Because it didn't have to happen. I wasn't the villain they made me out to be. I was the only one who tried to prevent this. Now the flood zone was a monument to ignored truth. And the water had written the final word in the soil for all to see. By the seventh day, the floodwaters had begun to recede, but what they left behind was something even more unforgiving than destruction. Accountability, the kind that no HOA meeting or citation letter could bury beneath landscaping jargon or community bylaws, and as state investigators, environmental response units, insurance assessors, and federal agents began swarming the ruins of Elms Ridge Estates, the once smug architects of the neighborhood's so-called harmonized community vision were now dodging microphones, law enforcement inquiries, and civil suits with the same clumsiness they once used to dodge my warnings about. Flood risk, and the irony couldn't have been sharper as I stood beside the same officials who once dismissed my reports as alarmist and non-relevant to current zoning, now quoting my own charts and floodplain simulations back to me as if I hadn't already sent them months before. The state's emergency oversight director, a stern-faced woman in a soaked brown windbreaker, shook my hand firmly and said, "Mr. Havers, I want to apologize on behalf of this department. You were right. They were criminally negligent." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply handed her my final compiled report, tabbed, indexed, time-stamped, showing the exact sequence of events, from the HOA's first citation to the very moment the dam was breached, and how every single chapter in that timeline was accompanied by a documented warning from me or a licensed hydrologist that had been ignored, deleted, or flat-out laughed at. Karen, meanwhile, had been taken into protective custody, not arrested, not yet, but officially detained for questioning pending charges of falsifying environmental assessments, illegally influencing county zoning decisions, and using her authority to suppress resident complaints about drainage safety issues. The evidence was overwhelming, emails from her to the county commissioner promising increased donations in exchange for permit reversals, records showing she ordered HOA funds to be used to hire a third-party inspector who wasn't even licensed in the state, and internal memos from Elms Ridge Development LLC that bragged about removing the nuisance barrier on my property so Phase 3 of their expansion could begin construction unhindered. Those documents had been buried deep, some encrypted, some deleted, but I'd found them, pulled them from backup servers with the help of a sympathetic IT specialist whose parents lived in a now-destroyed home at the basin's edge. When those files hit the hands of federal auditors, everything changed. This wasn't just about a flood anymore, it was fraud, conspiracy, and endangerment on a scale that sent ripples through the state capitol. The governor released a statement calling it a catastrophic failure of local governance, and within hours, the county's zoning director resigned. Investigators from the State Department of Natural Resources arrived with forensic engineers and began mapping the water flow paths using drones and LiDAR, and every model they ran confirmed it. The dam, had it remained intact, would have slowed runoff enough to prevent 90% of the structural damage. Elms Ridge wasn't just poorly planned, it was criminally mismanaged. The media descended on the story like vultures. Every major outlet ran the headline in some variation: HOA ordered dam removed, flood destroys neighborhood. Interviews poured in. Survivors told stories of how they had been fined for sandbags, told not to install drainage trenches, discouraged from building raised foundations because it violated visual uniformity. And the more they spoke, the worse the HOA looked. Residents who once defended Karen now turned against her, filing class action suits and demanding answers about why their insurance was being denied due to known, unmitigated risk factors, a phrase that kept surfacing in policy reviews now that the dam's original existence had been made public. Lawyers for the HOA tried to spin the narrative, blaming climate change, accusing the county of failing to provide emergency alerts, even suggesting I had sabotaged the land after the demolition. But the state's forensic team debunked every claim. Soil studies matched my data exactly. Satellite rainfall reports confirmed my forecast models to within an inch. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's Ring camera showed HOA contractors destroying functional drainage outlets and what they described as beautification improvements. It was over. And yet, despite all the chaos, I remained calm. I didn't scream, I didn't retaliate. I simply kept showing them the facts over and over again until even the most cynical bureaucrat had no choice but to face the truth. In a private meeting with the state attorney general's office, I was told that criminal charges would be pursued not just against Karen, but also the developers, 2 county employees, and the unlicensed inspector whose falsified report had greenlit the dam's removal. "You'll be asked to testify," they said. "We'll need your original files, emails, sensor logs, everything." I told them they'd have it all, already organized. And then, because I wasn't done, I made one final request. I want the land where the dam once stood returned to me, formally protected under state conservation law, and I want a memorial placed there, something that reminds people what happens when they silence experience in favor of ego. The director nodded slowly. "You'll have it," he said. "And I think a lot of people owe you more than that." That night, I sat on my porch alone, watching the lights from helicopters flicker over the ruined basin, and for the first time in weeks, the rain finally stopped, not a drizzle, not a mist, just stopped. The clouds began to clear, and beneath them, the shattered bones of Elms Ridge lay bare in the moonlight. Justice hadn't yet arrived fully, but it was on the road, and I knew when it came, it wouldn't knock, it would bulldoze the lies and raise the truth in its place, one ledger, one affidavit, one criminal charge at a time. When the final reports were published and the lawsuits officially filed, Elms Ridge Estates no longer existed as a legal entity. It was dissolved, bankrupt, its board members scattered and disgraced, their once flashy title of HOA director now permanently tied to a nationally televised disaster that experts would cite for years to come as a textbook example of what happens when bureaucracy, vanity, and profit override science, responsibility, and common sense. And as the excavators arrived not to build but to clean, to scrape away the waterlogged skeletons of homes, playgrounds, and paver-lined walking paths, I stood. With state officials and environmental engineers on the very spot where my dam had once stood tall and silent, a monument to prevention, torn down by those too blind to see its worth, and I was asked one question again and again by reporters, residents, even government suits: do you plan to rebuild it? My answer never changed. Not for them. For the land. Because the truth was, this place didn't need HOA newsletters or decorative gazebos or property value charts. It needed stewardship, understanding, and above all, humility. That dam hadn't just held back water, it had held back consequences. And now that those consequences had spilled across the valley, destroying not just homes but reputations, careers, and illusions, maybe, just maybe, people would stop pretending that nature could be managed by vote. The lawsuits came swiftly: residents versus HOA, HOA versus the county, developers versus insurance firms, and most notably, the state versus Taryn Turner, formerly known as HOA president, now officially under federal indictment for conspiracy, environmental sabotage, and obstruction. She pleaded not guilty. Of course she did. But the evidence was overwhelming: emails, falsified reports, misappropriated funds, and direct orders to move forward with demolition regardless of community dissent or independent hydrology warnings. I testified at her trial, calmly, with my binder of logs, my photographs, my sensor readings, and my certified permits. The courtroom was packed. Survivors from Elms Ridge sat behind her, their eyes hollow, arms crossed, listening to me explain how their own leader had silenced the only voice that tried to protect them. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 18 years. No parole for the first 10. As she was led away, she passed me in the aisle, her once flawless blouse wrinkled, her eyes still defiant but no longer in control. She didn't speak. Neither did I. The land had already said enough. Over the next 6 months, the basin was declared a restricted zone, unfit for development, and finally recognized as a high-risk floodplain, just as I had warned from the beginning. FEMA coordinated with the state to launch a recovery plan, but no one would ever live there again. It was to be returned to nature, with one exception: a new earthen dam, smaller but efficient, was constructed with federal and state grants, using designs I had sketched decades ago and updated with new tech. I didn't ask to oversee it. They asked me. And I did, on one condition: that no HOA, developer, or private body could ever lay claim to the structure again. It was to be held in public trust. Forever. When the dam was completed, they held a small ceremony. Nothing fancy, just a few state reps, a handful of former residents, and a bronze plaque bolted to a granite stone near the new spillway that read, "In memory of those who learned too late, listen to the land, or pay its price." I didn't speak that day. I just stood at the back, hands in my coat, watching the water flow slowly, calmly, the way it was always meant to. I returned home to my quiet ridge, my porch now repaired, my fields finally green again. No HOA trucks. No citations. No surveillance. Just the sound of birds, the rustle of wind through the pines, and the distant echo of water moving safely through a system built not for ego, but for endurance. Every so often, a car would stop at the base of the ridge, someone walking up to knock on my door and ask, "Are you the guy from the dam story?" I'd nod, offer coffee, and tell them the real version, not the headlines, not the drama, but the lesson. Because if there's one thing this whole ordeal taught the world, it's that you don't fight nature and win, not with fines, or politics, or pretty fences.